Gestalt and Perception. Perception helps us interpret the world around us. We rely on it to understand our surroundings. For example, we develop ideas about an upcoming event based on our personal and past experiences. We view the world through our individual perceptions. Visual communication. One of the primary forms of communication is visual communication. If you placed two people in a room for a week, neither of whom spoke the same language, they would rely on physical gestures and drawing images to communicate. Body language is one of our strongest forms of visual communication. We unconsciously rely on it to supply cues and information more so than the spoken word. When talking, between 60 and 90% of the message is communicated through body language, leaving the remainder attributable to the spoken word. In the commercial arts, we rely heavily on images to communicate with our audience. The brain at work, eliminating details. Visual information is often altered once it travels through the eye to the brain. The brain simplifies preconceived information, eliminating details it deems unnecessary. For example, consider a traffic stop sign. We know through learned behavior what a stop sign looks like and its meaning. When we approach a stop sign, we don't need to observe all the fine details to understand what the sign means and the action it's requiring. Because it's a familiar sign, at a glance, we know to stop the vehicle. At the brain at work, distance counts. The distance between the distance from the viewer to an object also affects the way that the brain interprets visual information. Continuing with the stop sign example, if you are half a block away from the sign, your brain understands its meaning. The same is true if you're standing 5 feet away from the sign. But if you were to observe the same sign while flying overhead in a plane, it would not be recognizable. Your mind would perceive it as a point on the ground. So to summarize, the brain will understand familiar objects at varying distances except for extreme distance. Consistency of presentation. Perception begins at birth. At birth, we are regularly exposed to images and symbols. We become accustomed to certain visual consistencies. We have an expectation of how specific things should look. So, for example, the stop sign. It has a specific size, height, and color. Symbols such as public restroom signs, the human face, which has 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, or a world map. How all of those look are things that we have consistent in presentation. Let's look at the world map. Generally speaking, maps are created with land displayed as brown or green. In water, such as oceans, seas, lakes, rivers, those are shown in blue. Countries are identified with borders made of thicker lines, and if individual states are displayed, those state borders are thinner than those used to separate countries. If we were to reverse the color of the water and make it brown, or if we were to change the thickness of the lines around the states, making those thicker than those the boundaries around the countries, it would create havoc with our brain's preconceived idea of the map. In his book, Contemporary Color Theory and Use, Steve, and I'm sorry I cannot pronounce your last name, so please forgive, he talks about an experiment using a stop sign. The color of the sign was changed from red to green, with everything else remaining the same, including the location of the sign. Drivers regularly drove through the intersection without stopping. When pulled over by the researchers and questioned, the drivers often said they saw the sign, but because the sign was green and green means go, they didn't stop. Another example of consistency of presentation at play. Cultural exceptions. Some perceptions are universal, such as understanding the human face, while other perceptions are cultural. In Western countries, the tradition is for a bride to wear white. In China, the tradition is for the bride to wear red. In China, the color white is worn for mourning. So what is Gestalt? Perception rules are derived from Gestalt psychology, which was developed in Germany in 1912. Gestalt perception states, the viewer can understand relationships between the different design elements using incomplete information. We unconsciously take the incomplete parts and develop a whole image within the viewer's mind. We rely on size, form, value, and placement of all the design elements on the picture plane to understand the image. Each component of composition relies on and is affected and affects one another. In other words, the whole is comprised of the parts. So here are just a few selected perception concepts. One is overlay. When shapes overlay one another, the shape that lays on top gives the illusion of being closest to the viewer. Closure. Closure is when an object is partially drawn, yet the brain reads the object as a whole. In other words, the brain fills in the form using existing visual information. Enough visual information must be supplied for the brain to jump to the right conclusion. We talked about this concept when we discussed having enough visual information. Similarity. When objects share similar features, they are interpreted as a group or set. Proximity helps to strengthen this concept. Nearness or proximity. When objects are placed near one another, they can read as a group. The shapes can be similar or not. The nearness of the forms is what counts. And figure ground. The mind perceives a figure, positive space, and the ground, negative space. This concept we've studied when we studied negative positive space.